"I'll give you 100K if you untie me." The words hung in the hot air like a bargain nobody should accept. He said them with the blunt certainty of a man used to deals, his voice edged with panic. He was half slashed by sunlight and shadow, luxury coat stained with bark and dust, cufflinks catching the afternoon like tiny, accusing moons. Thick ropes had him pressed against a low branch of an old sycamore. The ropes were rough, smelling faintly of sap and damp earth. Around him, the city hummed at a distance. Distant traffic, an occasional shout, while right there the world narrowed to the scrape of hemp against skin and the steady, insistent ringing in his suit pocket. Ricardo Almeida, 52, counted his wins in buildings and contracts, in shares and signatures. He counted successes the way other men counted breaths, reflex, habit, a metric by which to measure a life. He had known how to buy the right art, how to hold meetings that changed markets, how to make a word on a page turn into a number in a bank. He had never been very good at small, ordinary things, the kind that refused to be scheduled into a calendar, bedtime stories, school plays, a child's breath on his collarbone as she fell asleep. Now suspended by a rope in a park he had only come to because his phone had pinged with a low battery warning as he chased a missed call. Ricardo looked absurd. His expensive shoes were scuffed with mud. A smear of sap streaked his wristwatch. His phone lay 6 feet away, the screen a flat, bright eye, buzzing with a dozen missed messages. Investor greetings, a reminder about a merger. Jorge's name lighting up the top of the list. He could almost hear the voice on 1,000 voicemails. Numbers at the end of things, consequences that could be tallied. He could imagine the way a board noticed absence and started to reorganize itself without you. The tree shadow kept him cool in patches. Heat pressed like a slow hand on his back, and then she appeared, a small figure at the edge of the clearing, a bright dot of color against the browned grass. A red dress speckled with white like tiny blooms, blonde hair in a loose braid, a pair of worn sneakers. In one small hand, scissors, pink plastic handles dulled from use. In the other she clutched a modest bouquet of roadside wildflowers, stems wrapped with a scrap of ribbon. She stopped a foot away and tilted her head. Her blue eyes, startling and clear, measured him the way a child measures a new puzzle. She did not seem impressed, nor terrified. She seemed to see the situation with a patience born of grown-up rules and a child's purity. "Hey," she said. The voice was matter-of-fact, like someone stating a rule at school. "Why are you tied up?" He would have given 1,000 contracts for a simple out. He tried to explain, the story falling into frantic edges. "I tripped. A ladder. A stupid—" He swallowed, felt the rope cut into his palms. "I'm late for a meeting. Very late. Important people are waiting." She flicked a flower petal between her fingers. "Who's waiting?" "Investors," he said. "Partners. My company." She did not know what investors were. She did not need to. What she needed to know was the shape of a man who chose money over something else that had a simpler name. A daughter's face when he was gone. "Do you have a daughter?" she asked, blunt as a fact. The question landed like cold water. For a moment he held it like that, as if suspended, because the syllables were two small things. One, a yes or no, the other an identity, and yet together they exposed the exact thing he had been avoiding for years. He thought of a photograph he had not looked at in months, a small handprint on a paper cup, the tiny scuffs on the back of a stuffed bear he used to forget under a bed. He thought of a voicemail he had never played, of a birthday message left unheard. He realized amongst the rope and the heat and the ridiculousness that his daughter's face had been reduced in his life to a line item. Parental duties, optional. "Yes," he admitted, "an 8-year-old. Julia." The child's mouth tightened, pivoting from curiosity to a small, fierce calibration. "Is she with you now?" she asked. "No." The word made his throat ache. The girl, Bea, as her little name tag later confirmed in a sentence that would be as ordinary as it was decisive, leaned in, scissors dangling from her fingers. They glinted like a tiny flag. Pink, cheap plastic, saved from a corner of someone's drawer. She set the bouquet on the ground beside the roots, the wild color an odd counterpoint to his suit. Her knees bent, the hem of her dress brushed the grass. "Who are you here for?" she asked. Not for her? He wanted to say everything at once. He wanted to say that he loved her, that airports smelled like perfume and stale coffee, and that he used to put tiny notes in his jacket for her to find, that he had been building things so they could have something more. He wanted to point to the bank accounts, the investments, the plans, but all of those explanations sounded like the softest excuses when framed by a child's simple question. "I try," he said finally. It was small, but it was the only honest thing he could give. "I try to make things so she will have what she needs." Bea's face went solemn for a second, the way a small person considers the machinery of an adult's life and decides where truth hides among gears. "My mom says people who give money only want to make themselves look good. She says if you help someone, you help them so they can keep their head up." She twirled the scissors absent-mindedly, not threatening but precise. "She told me never to take money from strangers. She said paybacks make people small." Ricardo blinked. He had never before heard the word paybacks used as an ethical criterion in a sentence so sharp. He reached instinctively into his inner pocket. There, tucked like a hard secret, was the check. Thick paper, a number scrawled across its face in a way that still made him feel like a god. He drew it out and unfolded it, and the sun caught on the ink as if to make the promise glitter. "I'll give you 100,000, he said again, and this time he meant it. Bea stared at the check like she was trying to translate a foreign coin. She did not take a step closer. She did not look at the ink. She looked at Ricardo's eyes. "My mum says, if someone is stuck, you help because they are stuck, not because they can do something for you later." She tapped the heel of her palm to the middle of the check with a tiny, decisive finger. "I can't take that." The refusal was not spectacle. It wasn't dramatic. It was a firm, ordinary no, the kind that people learn at kitchen tables. Bea's face was steady. There was a dignity in her posture that had nothing to do with money. It had to do with rules taught and kept. Not out of pride, but out of a map for how to move through the world. Ricardo felt the world tilt. He had practiced refusals in boardrooms. "No thanks," he would tell a rival, or "not at this valuation," when an offer didn't suit him. But he had never faced a refusal that emptied the currency in his hand of its value. The check for a heartbeat felt like an offering he no longer recognized. "Why not?" he asked, not only to know but to buy time. He wanted to understand the rule and perhaps to overturn it. Money could unlock doorways. Was she denying him the key? "It's not for me," she said simply. "And my mom says people who make deals like that expect you'll pay something later. Maybe not money, maybe time, maybe smiles that aren't real. I don't want anyone to owe me or me owe anyone because of money." She cut him loose. She used the pink scissors with the kind of delicate confidence children show when they have done something useful before. The blades were thin and old. The rope yielded with a dry whisper. He slid down from the tree with all the awkwardness of a man who had forgotten how to bend without checking his posture. The sunlight poured back over him, unflattering and persistent. He expected gratitude to billow out of him, a flood of relief. Instead, there was a sudden, vertiginous clarity. The phones in his pocket kept ringing, an instrument of habitual panic, but their songs felt distant now. The ring of a phone was a metric he had used all his life to measure urgency. Standing on loose leaves, dirt oozing under his shoes, the noise became less compelling. He offered the check again out of a reflexive guilt. "Please," he said, "at least take this so I can repay you." She brushed a wildflower against his sleeve, leaving a sticky smudge of pollen. "My mum says gifts are for the person you want to be." She folded the bouquet and held it between them like a small, stubborn treaty. "She says you can be someone, even if you have nothing in your pockets." Ricardo laughed then, a sound that was half release and half shock. There was a tear, unfamiliar, rehearsed only by secretary-level memories, on the corner of his eye. The pink scissors swung from her fingers and caught the light. He thought of how many things he had tried to buy for Julia when he felt guilty, gadgets and trips and clothes with tags still on them. He thought of the last birthday present he had sent, a box that arrived days late, and the video call where his face flickered and froze, and he had missed her opening the box. He thought of his ex-wife's messages, notes of practicality and patience, calendar invites that read, "Pick up Julia, Arva 3 p.m., then went unanswered. "You don't know what it's like," he said, and realized the weakness of that plea in a moment. She did not care about his excuse. She cared about the thing itself, being present. "Maybe not," she said. "But my mom says when someone is stuck, you help so they learn to help themselves next time. You don't make them trade their pride for food." People had called his offers charity. He had corrected them, using words like philanthropy, impact investment, strategic giving. He had chosen words because they made him feel clean, but here, in the sunlight, the words fell flat. He folded the check and slid it back into his pocket because a paper promise suddenly felt like a lie he could not give in good conscience. Bia's refusal changed the tenor of the afternoon. It did not shame him with cruelty, it simply redirected the conversation. She asked one more question, the kind that strips an argument down to shapes. "Do you come home at night?" she asked. He thought, 1,000 bedtimes missed, an apologetic voice at the end of a bad day, a promise to be better that softened into busy work. He thought of Julia's last birthday cake, store-bought, candles blown out in a video somewhere his connection had failed, and the small private humiliation of knowing money had been no replacement for presence. "I try," he said, and then the word sounded like a map. He could hear his phone buzz again, frantic and drawn. He could hear the mental ledger of investors adjusting for his absence. He could see Jorge's name on the caller ID. Jorge, who had been his shadow for a decade, who knew the rhythm of Ricardo's life and the cadence of his excuses. He could imagine the board meeting happening without him, the decisions being made by absence, people rearranging the puzzle. Bia reached into her pocket and pulled out a tiny ribbon. She handed it to him with the grave solemnity of someone bestowing a charm. "My mum says keep something that smells like someone who loves you," she said. The ribbon smelled faintly of laundered shirts and lemon soap, domestic things that do not fit into an accountant's ledger, but hold a life together. He accepted it like a man accepting a new name. For the first time since the ropes had tightened around him, he felt an urge that had nothing to do with market share, an urge to be present. The story could have ended in the parking lot with a single decisive act. He could have folded the check in half, set it on a stump, and walked away. He could have slid the check into Bia's little hand and told her to use it for school supplies. He could have made the kind of dramatic gesture that headlines like. But the moment was quieter than that. It was a small, internal pivot. One of those changes that begin not with fireworks but with the soft rearrangement of priorities. Bia crouched and picked up a dandelion. She blew the fluffy seeds toward him, as if to set a small spell free. The seeds hung for a fraction of a second over his head, and then drifted away. He felt each one like a small possibility. He looked at his hands, at the rope marks forming pale lines across his wrists, and for the first time in a very long time, he understood the scale of what he had traded for a life that seemed fuller on paper than it felt in his chest. As a narrator, it's the kind of scene that makes you pause and ask yourself, what would you do? Would you let a child teach you about dignity? Would you finally listen to the persistent, annoying little voice that kept saying the right things at the wrong hour? If this is gripping you, if you feel that small tug in your chest too, take a moment, like the video, tap like and subscribe. There are more stories coming that whisper about choices like this one. After the breath and the ribbon and the cheap scissors, the first concrete thing Ricardo did was painfully ordinary. He reached for his phone but did not answer the call. He set it face down on the grass, the screen dark, the names of worried colleagues hidden. He closed his eyes and let the noise of the world fade to a distant murmur. Then, with a shaky thumb, he opened contacts and searched for a name he had avoided like a landmine. The name was simple: Maria Almeida, ex-wife, mother of his child, the person who had kept the little orbit of their family in place while he orbited elsewhere. He had conversations with her before, mostly logistical, brief, a text here, a missed voicemail there. He had not in years spoken the kind of thing that required a soft voice and patience. Not apologies folded neatly into promises, not the murmurs that fill a child's dark. His thumb hovered. He could imagine 100 excuses to delay, meetings to attend, voicemails to answer, investors to placate. But in the clearing under the sycamore, the scent of wildflowers and the memory of a ribbon from a little girl distilled into a single motive: presence. He pressed call. On the other end, a recorded voice chimed, "Maria Almeida busy. Please leave a message." For a second, his heart sank. He almost put the phone away, an old pattern of retreat. Then he touched the screen and instead left the simplest message he could make, honest, the kind of message small enough to be true. "Hi," he said. "It's Ricardo. He swallowed, the rope-marked skin suddenly ragged in his throat. "I'm okay. I'm in the park. Can I pick up Julia today? I want to try. If it's not a good time, I understand, but I'd like to try." He did not have a plan for what try would look like, nor did he have a guarantee of success. He had at that moment only the small, terrifying desire to show up. He left the message and sat back on his heels. He felt ridiculous. He felt exposed. He felt in a way he had spent years learning to avoid, a sliver of hope. A cabinet in him clicked open. Jorge, the assistant, would think this an odd deviation from protocol, yet if anyone could make the gears turn in a company that ran on precise schedules and predictable returns, it was Jorge. He had to be told. Meetings delegated, calls returned, the board explained. Delegating was the language of trust. He had rarely practiced it in the way that mattered now, not to free himself, but to free space for someone else to breathe into the work he had carried alone. He stood, still dizzy from the suddenness of his own decision, and offered the bouquet back to Bea. "Thank you," he said, because proper English for indebtedness was a sentence, not a check. She shrugged as if the bouquet had been a thing she had always meant to do. "You're supposed to help people because it's right," she said, "not because you feel bad later." She picked up her pink scissors, stuffed them into her pocket and turned to go. Carla, her mother, was waiting a short distance away on a bench. She looked up as Bea approached, and the two exchanged a small, private nod. Carla's hands were rough from cleaning other people's houses. Her apron hung like a banner of honest labor around her waist. She accepted Ricardo's eye with a courteous, measured gaze, neither judgmental nor ingratiating. She had seen every kind of man walk through her life, some leaving envelopes and others leaving broken promises. She was the one who taught Bea the rules about money, who had folded those beliefs into her daughter's childhood with the same care she used when mending a hem. Ricardo swallowed his pride. He wanted to say everything, that he was sorry, that he would hire Jose, that he would change things, but these were proclamations. He had learned that declarations were easy. The work was the act that followed. "Can I do something for you?" he asked Carla, not scripted, not performative. He meant it small and practical, a contact, a job lead, a chance for Jose the carpenter to make real money instead of unpredictable days. He was not offering handouts. He knew there was dignity in fair labor. He had friends in contracting, in procurement. He could call people, introduce names, open doors, make connections that meant months of steady income rather than one-off charity. Carla looked at him for a beat, measured the sincerity in his eyes, and nodded slowly. There's work in the North Side. People need cabinets, but they hire people with references, not with checks handed on a bench. If you can talk to the supplier, make sure he meets Jose, that we get him in for a trial. That would help. Ricardo found his voice matched the work. Not grand, not theatrical. I'll call them, he said. I'll make the introduction. No one will do favors. Just a fair shot. They exchanged numbers, his, as real as the company letterhead it came from, hers, written in the careful perpendicular script that is learned by hands that label and order. He promised nothing that sounded like a miracle, only a contact, honesty, a follow-through. It was as far from a check as one could come, a small concrete gesture. As he stood to go, Bea tugged at his sleeve. "Do you have a watch that doesn't ring a lot?" she asked, with the prescient understanding of someone who had seen the way phones took up space like hungry birds. He glanced at his wrist. The watch face, once a badge of success, now seemed like another glare of demand. He loosened his cuff and put the ribbon, Bea's ribbon, around the watch. It made the face softer, like a bandage on something that had injured him and needed gentleness rather than a fix. "You can call me," he said to Maria in another brief message he left after that, this time confident, asking for permission to come by that afternoon. It was a small proposal, almost laughable in its simplicity. But it was action, true, measurable, and terrifying. He walked away from the bench with the sycamore shrinking behind him, its leaves a green murmuring. The city's noise rose to meet him, a chorus he had learned to ignore. His phone buzzed once, then twice. He let it ring through. He told himself that the calls could wait for a little while, that a life rebuilt required someone else to answer the phone when the father chose otherwise. He made one small concrete move before the day ended. He found a bench and sat with his phone pressed flat, typing short messages with a new kind of care. To Jorge, "Start delegating the prep for next week's meeting. I'll call by day's end." To a contracting friend, "Do you have a slot for a skilled carpenter? I can vouch for workmanship." To Maria, "If today is okay, I'll pick up Julia at 3. If not, tell me a time and I'll make it work." Each message was a stone placed on the path from habit to habitable life. He did not know if the messages would be returned. He did not know if his presence would be welcomed or met with old protocols of protection. He did not know if, after a lifetime of buying comfort, he could indeed sit through the smaller, messy, cheaper rituals of family, a scraped knee, a homework argument, a bedtime no that opened into a small shared joke. But the thing that made him walk with a different gait was not the certainty of success. It was the quiet hunger of a man who had tasted possibility and found it more desirable than a balance sheet. The ribbon around his watch seemed to pulse like a tiny private alarm. There was, of course, resistance. The board would not wait forever. The market had no patience for personal epiphanies. He had an empire of contracts that demanded his name, his signature, his once-every-week closeness that could be scheduled. This was not simple. It was not theatrical. It was a mess, resignations to accept, people to empower, schedules to untangle. He had to trust Jorge to carry things he had always held alone. He had to risk that the company could survive his sudden insistence on showing up for something other than profit. The rope marks on his wrists itched like a memory. The pink scissors and the wildflowers had an authority no business case could refute. For the first time in years, he felt as if he were being offered not a transaction, but a task to change the distribution of his life. He met Bea's eyes once more before she and Carla disappeared along the path toward the apartment blocks where they lived. For a brief second, he saw in her the face of his own daughter, small, unjaded, utterly unafraid to name the truth. He made a promise then, not the gala sort, but the granular kind, to be there at pickup, to be present in the small ways that counted, to make introductions that carried dignity instead of handouts, to rearrange his calendar not simply with delegations, but with daily, ordinary practices that would cement change. The decision had been made in a public place, in an absurd moment that began with a check and ended with a ribbon. It was a modest, human, precarious beginning. He felt fragile in the way people do when they first admit a mistake, newly honest, painfully aware, and oddly relieved. He reached into his pocket and felt the check as a cool weight. He could have destroyed it, set it on a stump, and torn it into confetti. He could have cashed it. He could have done any number of things that would have looked like decisive action. Instead, he tucked it away and folded it neatly, an artifact of how he used to live, not a plan for how he would go on. He kept the ribbon tied to his watch, an unassuming talisman of a conversation with a small girl in a red dress who had no interest in his money, but a great interest in how people treated one another. As he walked toward the street, his phone finally buzzed with a text. "Jorge, everything okay? I can handle the Parsons meeting, you sure? Also..." And then a note of practical care. "Do you want me to call a cab for you?" Ricardo read the message, and for a moment simply smiled. He typed back, fingers fumbling as if learning to use them for tenderness. "Please take the meeting, and don't cancel anything without me knowing. I'll be late today. Also, can you call the supplier on Northside and set a meeting for Jose? I'll be there." He pressed send, then felt the trembling steadiness of a choice taking form. It was not salvation. It was a set of small steps, each one uncertain but honest. He was not yet the man he wanted to be. He was a man who had been untied by a child and had decided, finally, that his next investments would be of a different currency. He crossed the street and paused at the corner, listening to the city breathe. Phones buzzed in pockets around him. People moved with the habitual urgency of their errands. A woman pushed a stroller. A dog barked at the corner. He tucked his hands into his coat, and for the first time in years felt like someone who might be able to build a life not scored by numbers, but by faces. He lifted his head and, as if performing a private ritual, dialed his daughter's school. The line rang. On the second ring, a secretary answered with the practiced courtesy of someone who had heard every parental concern under the sun. "Is everything all right?" the voice asked. "Yes," he said, steady and small. "I'm Ricardo Almeida. Is Julia still here? I'm on my way to pick her up." There was a pause that felt like the catching of a breath across a room. "Yes," the secretary said kindly. "She's still here. She's in the reading room. We'll call her out." He thanked her and hung up. The traffic light at the intersection turned from red to green. A bus sighed by. A bicycle bell chimed as it passed. He stepped off the curb and walked toward the school, the ribbon around his watch rubbing against his wrist like a tiny insistence. He had no guarantee he would be welcomed. He had to face the messy aftermath of his absence. Conversations that would not be neat, trust that would require time to rebuild, small disappointments that could not be rearranged by a check or a speech. But as he approached the school gates, he felt a quiet resolve, the kind that begins with a decision and requires 1,000 modest confirmations afterward. He pushed open the door to the reading room, and there she was, curled over a picture book, her hair falling in soft disarray, the small concentration of a child on a page of pictures. She looked up as if sensing him, a blink of surprise transforming into the slow, cautious smile of a child learning how to greet a parent who has been away. The world narrowed to the small space between them, the chair, the book, the beats of patience and fear and possibility. Ricardo paused on the threshold. He did not know if she would run into his arms or hesitate. He did not know what the first conversation would be like. He had rehearsed nothing. He had maps of time that could be rearranged, delegations to execute, promises to keep, but none of that mattered without the actual doing. He took one more breath, the kind that costs a person the humility of truth, and stepped forward. The next moment would be the first confirmation of whether anything had changed. He reached out his hand. The child looked at him, then at his watch, then at his face. The ribbon fluttered where it was tied. For a breath that stretched like a thin wire, everything seemed to balance on the answer she might give. He was about to speak when his phone, left face down on the grass earlier, buzzed insistently in his coat pocket. He froze, the gesture of reaching for his daughter stalled by a small automatic reflex. The city's demands pressed at his sleeve, a reminder that the rest of his life would not wait to be rearranged. He could let it ring. He could let the moment with his daughter be something sacred he would not trade for a single ping. Or he could answer and let the world claim its piece of him back, as it always had. He felt the ribbon against his wrist, the tactile promise of the afternoon. He felt the memory of Bia's clear blue eyes and the pink scissors glinting as she had cut the ropes. He felt, faint but insistent, the sense that one small child's willingness to hold him accountable had shifted something. He slid his thumb toward the screen, not to answer, but to let it die down. The call went to voicemail. He looked back at his daughter and smiled, an awkward, hopeful smile, and said the first honest thing he had mustered all afternoon. "I'm here," he said. "I'm here," he said. She looked at him for a moment that stretched like a small, careful bridge. Then she slid from the chair and walked over, shoes whispering on the carpet. Julia's hand fit into his like a puzzle piece that had been turned the wrong way for too long and finally clicked. There was no grand embrace at first, too much habit, too much history, but there was a hand and a look that asked 1,000 soft, necessary questions. He sat beside her, and for 10 minutes they read a picture book in which the pages smelled faintly of glue and possibility. He let the words come out crooked. He let the pauses be clumsy. He let silence be part of what he offered. Outside, life tried its old tricks. His phone vibrated 3 times against his jacket. Investors, a message from a lawyer, Jorge confirming the Parsons meeting. He set it face down, the ribbon at his wrist a small, steady reminder. He kept his promise to be present for that afternoon, because presence, he was learning, did not ask for proof to matter. Maria answered the door that afternoon with a mix of guarded courtesy and a tiredness that had become her daily armor. She let him in with rules. No speeches, no long histories, only straightforward promises he intended to keep. He listened. He learned that trust was not an event, but a ledger of small, repeated deposits, pickups on time, calls that were answered, homework help that lasted longer than a photo op. The first weeks were awkward. Julia tested him the way children test new shoes, by running, jumping, pressing corners. He learned to accept the small failures as part of the work. He arrived early for pickups and stayed late for reading time. He learned her school schedule. He learned the names of her friends. He made oatmeal badly and learned to get better. He sat through a parent-teacher meeting and let the teacher speak without interrupting. He missed a morning meeting and let the emails pile. There were consequences, but they were manageable. Word traveled slower in the world of family than it did in commerce, but it traveled true. Maria watched him with the kind of skepticism that has saved many people from hurt. Gradually, she watched him accumulate small proofs of change. He returned library books. He remembered permission slips. He sat through math homework and did not fix it with a quick answer. He talked to Julia not as an expense to be managed, but as a person to be known. He also set to work on what he could do beyond a father's presence. He made the calls he had promised on that afternoon under the sycamore. He emailed his friend in procurement. He arranged a meeting with a supplier on the north side. He did not write checks on a bench. He wrote introductions, drafted fair trial periods, and stood in a workshop smelling of sawdust and varnish, while José, a man who measured his days by the grain of wood, showed him a cabinet door he had made. Ricardo watched the way José's hands moved, sure and exact, and he felt a recognition that was not simply charitable. It was practical. Jose could work. He had skill. All he needed was a door opened. The supplier met Jose for a trial, not because Ricardo waved a check, but because he vouched for craftsmanship and reliability in a network where reputation mattered. Jose started as a trial hire. He arrived early on his first day and left late, his face flushed with the work's honest exhaustion. The supplier watched him finish a piece and nodded. Within a month, Jose had steady hours. The pay was fair. The contract was steady. With income came relief and the small things that steady pay affords: predictable meals, a quiet greeting at home, the ability to fix a leaky roof without waiting for a miracle. He did not become wealthy overnight. Neither did he need to. He could breathe without counting pennies. Carla's response to Ricardo shifted in tonal increments. She saw the difference between a man who wanted to make himself look good and a man who used influence to build stable chances for others. Ricardo did not make grand pronouncements about dignity. He simply showed up at the supplier's office, signed paperwork ensuring Jose could be treated as an employee, and followed up. Weeks later, he bought a small set of tools for the family's kitchen table so Jose could finish a few at-home orders. He arranged for a real, verifiable reference. Carla, who had taught her daughter firm rules about money at kitchen tables between mop buckets and laundry, nodded the way people do when trust begins to replace suspicion. At the office, the changes were structural and awkward at first. The board preferred predictable patterns, and his sudden insistence on presence looked at first like indulgence. There were angry emails. There were investors who asked for phone calls and answers. Ricardo negotiated. He delegated. Delegating at that scale was not a mere task assignment. It was a cultural shift. He sat down with Jorge and admitted how much he had hoarded. He made Jorge responsible for several portfolios and gave him authority, not a dummy title, but real decision-making capacity. Jorge, who had been Ricardo's shadow for years, stumbled under the weight at first, but rose as he had never been given the chance to rise. Ricardo coached him in high-level strategy while letting day-to-day operational choices pass to him. He set boundaries: no meetings before 6 in the morning for family obligations, a strict no phones at the dinner table policy for executive meetings, and a mandatory presence day each week where senior staff could not schedule after-hours calls. Some of the board grumbled. A minority even threatened to pull money. Ricardo listened, balanced spreadsheets against human accounts, and stayed the course. He did not romanticize risk. He negotiated terms with investors that protected the company while giving him room to be a father. To everyone's surprise, productivity did not collapse. The delegation brought new energy. Decisions were made faster, teams felt trusted, and Jorge, empowered and visible, brought fresh ideas that resonated with clients. The firm's quarterly numbers steadied and then regained momentum. The sounds of phones at night in Ricardo's house dimmed, and yet the company endured. There were external tests of the change. A lucrative acquisition came at a moment when the board needed a signature and a weekend. It was the kind of deal that would have been his once: a headline, a win, a number flicked across a screen. He took a long look at the contract, then at the children's drawings on his refrigerator, at the ribbon on his watch. He called Jorge and said, "You take the lead. I trust you." It was the single act that made the change feel permanent. He chose trust in another human over the reflex to close a deal himself. Jorge negotiated with skill and, in the end, brought back an agreement that honored both the company's interests and the new frameworks Ricardo insisted upon: fairness for workers, sustainable timelines, and a clause that ensured part of the profits would be reinvested in community programs near the Northside supplier. The company grew not despite Ricardo's absence, but because he had finally built teams that could succeed without him as a bottleneck. At home, he and Maria built new rhythms. They made rules together. He would be responsible for Friday night dinners. She would lead Saturdays with a plan for chores and homework. They negotiated custody the way adults in negotiation learn to, practical, sometimes clumsy, but grounded in the child's need rather than the adult's pride. On Friday nights, he learned to cook rice so as not to burn it. He learned his daughter's favorite lullaby and sang it even when his voice cracked. He learned to tuck notes into her lunchbox and found joy in the small embarrassments of being present. He did not do everything perfectly. There were relapses, an urgent call he answered wrongly, a missed recital where his flight landed late, but each misstep was met with repair. He learned to apologize properly, to make amends with time and gestures rather than excuses. He learned the arithmetic of trust. 100 small truths were worth more than one grand performance. Months later, standing in his downtown penthouse with its glass walls and a view that looked like a painting of ambition, he felt a strange emptiness. The apartment had been his measure of success, a place where he could retreat and listen to the echo of his own decisions. He had sold places before. This time, the sale felt like shedding something that no longer fit. He sold the penthouse and bought a modest house 3 blocks from Julia's school. It was not a downgrading so much as a reorientation. The house had a kitchen that fit people rather than catering an ego. It had a small garden where wildflowers grew in an unruly, honest patch. The pink scissors found a drawer with the other small things he kept for their meaning, not their price. The check lived in a small envelope in the top of his desk drawer, folded, untouched, an artifact of a man he had been rather than a plan for who he wanted to be. The exchange of spaces did not make him a better father overnight. It made the logistics easier. Morning walks, distance that meant more dinners, a backyard for playing pirates and building forts. It allowed him to be the kind of neighbor who could bring over a plate or help with a leaky faucet. He became a man whose home invited noise rather than curated silence. He began small philanthropic programs, not grand foundations, but practical, focused initiatives that matched dignity with opportunity. The company offered a pilot program, paid apprenticeships for local tradespeople with real wages and mentorship. Jose became part of that program, the first mentee, and later a recommended hire for another supplier across town. When Jose brought Carla's family to a modest celebratory dinner, his pride apparent in the way he spoke of steady pay and the ability to fix a leaking roof, Ricardo sat across from them and felt the kind of satisfaction money cannot buy. It was not the gift of cash that fixed things. It was the signal of being seen and trusted in a market that often overlooked skill for the wrong reasons. There were small public gestures that accompanied the private changes. Jorge's profile rose in the company. He began to be introduced at conferences as the man who had transformed operations. Ricardo lent his name to a small apprenticeship program in the community, but he insisted the program be run by local leaders and not by a central PR arm. He wanted help given in ways that preserved autonomy. He visited the workshops and learned to sand a walnut edge with a calm absurdity that made the workers laugh. The workers taught him to measure with his eye rather than with the arrogance of a printout. It was humbling and instructive. Julia watched the change with a child's pragmatic clarity. She liked the new sandwiches he packed. She liked that he remembered to bring a scarf when it was cold. She loved that he came to her school play, sat in the 3rd row, clapping too loudly, and afterwards made an awkward, earnest attempt to copy her drawing. She forgave him slowly, as kids do, in quarters and half smiles. There were nights when she would wake and he would be there, a quiet silhouette, moving to sit on the bed and read by the low light. Those nights accumulated. Trust, like anything else, became the sum of repeated acts. The pink scissors reappeared often in small, surprising ways. Once, when Julia and Bea had drawn a chain of paper birds, they insisted he help cut them out. He clumsily held the paper while they snipped with the pink handles, and laughter filled the room in a way his boardroom had never heard. Another time he'd pass the scissors to Carla, who used them to mend a hem on her apron. Another honest labor, another small dignity. Eventually, the scissors were tucked into the top drawer of his new home, a talisman he looked at sometimes when he felt the old urge to flee into numbers and noise. One year after the sycamore, there was a small gathering beneath the same tree. Not a ceremony but a picnic, blankets spread, sandwiches, coffee cooling in thermos flasks. The family who had once sat on a bench across the park were now part of a shared moment. Carla and Jose, Bea with her pink scissors tucked into her back pocket, Julia chasing after a dragonfly, Jorge leaning on a picnic table and laughing like someone newly unburdened. The company had not imploded, it had adapted. The supplier on the north side had grown, in part because of the steady labor force, and in part because people began to prefer suppliers who treated workers well. The apprenticeship program had a waiting list. Ricardo sat on the blanket and watched his daughter pick a dandelion and hand it to Bea with the kind of care he had only lately learned to practice. He thought of the check folded in his drawer, of the moment when paper had glittered like a promise, and a small hand had said no. He thought of the ribbon around his watch that had frayed softly with use, of Jorge's confident emails, of Jose's call the other day telling him about an extra shift he'd finally declined because he had the kind of steady schedule that let him be home for dinner. The proof of change was not a single dramatic act, but the accumulation of small things. Ricky had learned to choose time over a certain kind of cash. He had learned to use his resources as channels rather than bandages, introducing people, signing references, creating programs that paid fairly and trained well. He had learned to build habits, phone-off dinners, Saturday errands together, a weekly trip to the farmer's market where Julia learned the names of vegetables. He had learned to be present without making his presence a spectacle. There were moments when the old world tried to pull him back. Once a high-stakes investor called with an ultimatum: move faster, take more risk, or be left. For a heartbeat, he felt the old reflex, the thrill of closing a deal that would make headlines. He thought of the ribbon, of the way Jose had grinned when he got his pay stub, of the sound of his daughter's laugh in the backyard. He asked for time. The investor demanded a meeting. Ricardo asked Jorge to lead and trusted him with the decision. The meeting went forward. The firm did not lose its edge. It gained a fuller definition of success, one that included people as well as profit. Not everything in the story was tidy. There were critics who called his moves PR or softness or indulgence. There were setbacks, reallocated budgets that needed tough decisions, a supplier who reneged on a promise, a contracted job that fell through. Troubles came with the ordinary life of action and consequence. He learned to respond without panic. He learned the difference between rescue and responsibility. When a problem arose with the apprenticeship program, he did not throw money at it. He listened to the apprentices and adjusted the mentorship model. When a supplier balked at better wages, he negotiated a longer-term contract that balanced margin with fair pay. The adjustments were messy but honest. But in the small domestic rituals, the real work was visible. When Julia had a nightmare, he was the one who answered. When a teacher called asking for a parent volunteer, he said yes and went. He built a system at work so that no single person was indispensable. He kept the check folded, a relic of an earlier life, and sometimes he took it out to look at the number like one might look at an old photograph of a face that used to belong to you. He never cashed it. One late winter evening, months after the sycamore incident, his daughter came into his newly modest kitchen with a paper boat. "I made this for you," she said. The boat was painted clumsily in watercolor, and she had glued a tiny strip of ribbon to the mast, some of the ribbon that had once been on his watch. He felt a tenderness so sharp it thinned the lines on his face. He kept the boat on the dashboard of his car for weeks. The community noticed the change too. At the supplier's shop, a woman who oversaw a neighborhood cooperative told him that his actions had ripple effects, that local hiring patterns were shifting because people preferred to work where they were respected. Jorge wrote a profile piece about the firm's apprenticeship policy that circulated among industry groups and generated modest interest. Jose recommended 3 other tradespeople who then found stable positions. Carla enrolled in a short certification course that fit around her cleaning shifts and, with the extra work, was able to replace a stove that had been leaking for years. These were not miracles, but improvements, measurable, steady, dignified. At home there were other rituals he kept. He picked wildflowers each week and folded them into the corner of his daughter's drawings. On clear nights, he lay on the small back porch while Julia told him the details of her day, the things adults might call trivial but which for him became the currency of a mended life. He kept the ribbon frayed and soft. The pink scissors stayed tucked in a jar labeled crafts, where he could find them and remember the child who had cut his ropes and started him on a new ledger of living. A year on, from the day he offered a check and had it refused, Bia came to a small fair at the local school. She and Julia ran through stalls selling lemon bars and crusty breads. Ricardo bought them each a box of crayons and sat under a tent listening to children sing. He watched with a muted astonishment as the world he had been so busy constructing for profit actually supplied a life worth living. He thought of the man he had been, fast with decisions, slow with apologies, and felt a gratitude that had nothing to do with money. Near the end of the fair, Bia tugged at Ricardo's sleeve and walked him to a small, weathered bench under a young maple tree. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something wrapped in tissue, the pink scissors, the same pair that had cut him out of the tree months before. She handed them to Ricardo, with the solemnity of someone who knows the value of a small object. "You can keep them," she said, "so you'll remember." He took them with hands that still bore faint ridges from the rope. He felt the metal cool in his palm. He placed them gently into the drawer in his kitchen beside the ribbon and the little paper boat. He did not place them on a pedestal. They were not trophies. They were reminders. At home that night, after Julia had gone to bed with her head resting on a pillow he had fluffed himself, Ricardo sat at the kitchen table and opened the small envelope where the check lived. He smoothed it flat and looked at the number one more time. The ink had a way of making him feel the old adrenaline, the temptation to make numbers mean everything. He folded the check and placed it in a small box with other small reminders. A movie ticket stub, a postcard from a family trip he had once cancelled, the ribbon that had frayed with use. He slid the box into the top drawer and shut it softly. The check stayed unpaid and untouched because the payment he owed was not monetary. What he had paid with, what he gave away to get what he had been missing, was time. He exchanged late nights for mornings, late deals for early dinners. He traded headline-making moments for daily rituals. He invested presence where once he had invested capital. In that exchange his life changed. If you ask, did everything become perfect? The answer is no. The company faced market shifts, people left, new hires faltered, and old habits crept in. Change required constant tending. But the difference was that he now tended to it. He could resist the reflex to solve a problem by paying for silence. Instead, he used his leverage to create opportunities, steady work, references, mentorship, so people could stand without thanks. The pink scissors remained a small symbol, not because scissors are heroic, but because a child with a simple tool had cut a man loose from a set of priorities that had slowly strangled what mattered. The ribbon on his watch frayed down to a narrow thread that he eventually knotted again, and the knot felt like a contract he could keep. Years later, When people in the neighborhood spoke of Ricardo, they did not only speak of his deals or his net worth, they spoke of a man who had learned, painfully and imperfectly, to measure success in faces rather than figures. They spoke of a company that still made money, but which had become a stable place for talent to grow. They spoke of a family that kept showing up for one another, sometimes messy and often warm. On a clear evening under the sycamore, with fireflies beginning to stitch the dark, Ricardo sat with Julia on his lap and beer beside them, their small hands sticky from lemonade. He thought of the day he had offered a check, how simple the temptation had been, and how simple the refusal had redirected his life. He looked at his daughter's freckled nose, at the way her eyelids fluttered as she fought to stay awake, and he felt a richness that had nothing to do with numbers in a bank. He had promised $100K in a moment of panic and habit. The check had never been cashed. What he did next was not dramatic in headlines, but seismic in life. He put away the check and gave himself away, his time, his attention, his influence, so others could have steady work, and so his daughter could have a father who answered the door. He learned, finally, what the pink scissors had taught him without wanting to, that some debts are repaid not with money, but with life. If this story nudges something in you, the part that knows the cost of absence, tell us in the comments, what would you change today? And if you think someone needs to hear about a small, stubborn shift that became a life, share this with them.